Okay, for this discussion, we're going to go into a little bit of an interesting one because it's considered controversial. We're going to go over abortion, and we're going to take this from a little bit of an interesting perspective because I'm going to go from a individualist point of view because I feel there's no other way. Because if we go from any other point of view, it's going to be pretty much useless. And from the individualist point of view, basically, we're going to have two little schools of thought. Either completely pro life, which means we're going to view it as the child has a full right to life, or the actual mother will have a commodity right to the child when it comes to the actual abortion, which is going to infuriate people though as well, because when it comes to these abortion companies, they're going to state that they're getting the mother a discounted rate, but what I'll do is I'll explain why that doesn't really come into play either. First, let's go into the second part. Is they'll try to explain that the mother's getting a discounted rate because of income levels. Well, this doesn't really come into play because essentially what they are is they are subsidized companies. Essentially, they're getting taxpayer money to actually subsidize their company, and this money is essentially paying for a service for that company. So essentially, based on essentially factors, usually, basically, they're looking for certain weeks of gestation, and they essentially rate that for an actual product, and this is the way they figure for their profit on the child, despite what they end up telling the media. Now, what they do is when they actually validate for the actual price, when they actually calculate it out, what they do is they itemize every individual thing when they want to put it into their books, so it looks like they're actually not making much of a profit because they're itemizing every individual part. When if you compare this with an actual traditional doctor that you would go to, they don't itemize every individual item. They actually say this is an actual service. We're only billing for this one service. Such as if you go in for an operation, they don't itemize for every individual part. They actually state that you're paying for this whole unit, and these are the parts that go into the unit, and they state what parts go into it, but there is one complete price. And this is where you find a difference. And that's where you're going to find where they try to state there's only a 3% profit. 3% of these companies go into abortion. It's because what they do is they try to itemize each individual thing out, and they try to use this to reduce their actual profit, their actual view of profit viability on their models, but really it's much higher. Now, when it comes to the actual thing, you need to view this as the mother owns the actual fetal tissue. When you view this, you need to understand that basically what's happening is the mother's only is expecting to pay for an actual medical service. They're not going under the assumption that financial benefits are coming from this fetal tissue. If they're under that assumption, they would essentially consign it with the ability to earn money themselves, and where the abortion procedure would essentially be made in a safe manner for basically earning money. This would actually change much of what would be happening. Now, what we see here is a little bit different. Number one is obviously they're not concerned about the life of the fetus, because obviously they don't want any living tissue. And number two, they're not concerned about the life of the patient because they really don't care about the outcome, because they're not essentially a stakeholder in this whole thing. If they die, they die. This doesn't really matter. This is why they have actually gone against the idea of improving their conditions. Now, if they're an actual stakeholder in this process, this would not stand, because you would essentially be pushing for ensuring that the whole process was fast and quick, and that they could essentially earn their profit and go along. And there would be a consignment process with this, with each of the parties. You'd have the person selling basically being the mother. You'd have the intermediary being the abortionist, and then you'd have the final sale being whichever medical company was essentially buying, medical company or whichever type of business was buying the tissue, which is essentially the third party. They would be dealing with it, and you'd have essentially the abortionist would be the intermediary making the actual sale. Now they would essentially be making on their only charge would essentially be some type of a consignment fee, and essentially they would be making some type of fee from both the purchaser and from both the purchaser for access to the sales, and from the actual sale itself, basically making money from both ends. And this is the way it should be going. Now, this is if we were to look at it from actually productively, from having freedom of the actual rights. But what we're actually seeing in this act is essentially what they're doing is they're lying to the mother and essentially engaging in what individualists would actually call theft. They're essentially lying to them, saying we're just going to dump this as biohazard and go behind their back and actually sell this as profit. And this is essentially what they're doing. This is essentially an act of theft from the mother. And their argument is that, oh, we need to make some of the money back from the process, and they're making excuses now. Well, the fact is this is, even if regardless of whatever government body wants to make as legality issues, those legality issues aside, when you're doing this is actually the point that you need to understand that the mother is a stakeholder in of this sale, and they should be the one earning the profit on this essentially sale of fetal tissue. They're the ones actually providing it. They're the provider of it. They're not some instead of just basically being stolen from. Instead, they're just basically what's happening is you're finding these abortion clinics are hitting these inner city areas, telling these women that it's less safe to bring a baby to a term than it is to have an abortion, to essentially raise their levels so essentially they can consume, so that they can get more money from this, because they're getting money from the governments, basically being both local and on the federal level, from subsidizing this as saying it's women's health, which it really isn't. If it was women's health, they would be upgrading the quality of these units, and from the actual sale, which is theft. So essentially, you're stealing from the taxpayer. You're stealing from both the taxpayer and from the actual provider of the fetal tissue, in this viewpoint of abortion. So we should be viewing this as theft, and it should be really, in this aspect, it should be going to the courts for both medical malpractice, because you're not even allowing these women to even get to the basic level of just a basic clinic, because these places don't even measure up to that, because a lot of these places are, number one, not even clean, number one. Number two, they can't, a lot of these places can't even fit a gurney through the hallway in case something goes wrong where they have to go to a place like such as a hospital to an ER if something goes very, very wrong, like a heart attack or something. And then when it comes to everything with it, there's a lot of these places that are a lot of these states that are allowing people who aren't even doctors to perform the procedure. I mean, you have Virginia just passed a law based on this. You have New York just passed a law based on this, and basically made it up to 9 months with pretty much generic excuses, such as you could say you're stressed out and be able to use this as an excuse. And then we also have the case of Vermont, where Vermont is essentially having the same thing, and Colorado essentially has had the same thing for a while, where you could pretty much have it up to 9 months with pretty much making a garbage excuse for the whole reason of that. And now this is basically going to end. This is basically set to essentially target these regions. Now, anybody looking at it seriously should be saying that this isn't just infant. Doesn't even go after the murder of infants. It's actually targeting people. Now, if you look at it that way with it, you should be looking at it that it's actually targeting races as well because of the strategic location. Anybody who runs demographics should be looking at it as well. They're not going into predominantly white areas. They're not going to predominantly Asian areas. They're actually going into black and Hispanic areas only. And this is aiming. If you look back at the writings of Margaret Sanger, her actual feelings were basically getting rid of all minorities because she felt that they were from an inferior stock, because it goes back to eugenics. Now, this is basically, it was meant as kind of like a soft way to get rid of these people that she felt were inferior, as well as other eugenicists felt were inferior. And while they try to state that she's some hero with it and try to gloss over this part by saying, "Oh, just ignore that. Don't pay attention to that." Well, the fact is this was her reasoning for doing these things, such as birth control, such as abortion. It had nothing to do with trying to allow women to basically freely have sex and all these other things. This was solely for the reason of being able to have to basically get rid of these essentially undesirable people that she did not want, or that all these other people out there did not want, and that they felt came from an inferior stock. She did not look at white people as the same way. If you look at where she was looking at and look through her writings, she did not view white people as an inferior stock. She felt that it was too difficult for white people to improve their birth numbers. So instead, she viewed the only effective way was for these minorities to actually reduce their birth numbers through this manner. And she felt that was the most effective way. Now, since a lot of Asians don't tend to fall for these fall for living in these areas because a lot of them have higher incomes, so they're not getting in these slum areas. They tend to focus on what they best can focus on, which is the Hispanic and black populations in the urban areas. They weren't exactly able to target because the actual Asian populations throughout the U.S. are actually a lot smaller than are some of the black and Hispanic populations. And this is just frankly the truth. When it comes down to the actual rights with it, these people, if they're going to actually have an abortion, they should have actually financial rights to it. And it shouldn't be that they consider these people unable to have the rights with it, because if you look at the history with it, basically all they're doing is their model is take advantage of these people because they feel that they're basically nothing but a cash crop. They basically take these people, consider them as a cash crop, take some of the money, donate it to the Democratic Party, as the Democratic Party will continue to support very, very friendly legislation, and give them money back as well to cover this money as well that they're spending, which ends up going out to like a neutral. And their excuse is, oh, we're not doing this as a favor. And because see, we have a different fund for that, for our political action committee, which is a bunch of BS, because they know it's a direct they know it's a direct thing, because they're essentially using their money for abortions and funneling it directly back in, and allows them to save money from the actual money that they get from these things to actually fund for more abortions. And they try to say, oh, but we do all these other things, such as cancer screenings and all these other activities. But if you look actually what actually happens is they don't do the cancer screenings. They don't do the mammograms. These are actually, all they do is they give referrals, because they don't have any of the materials on site at any of these operations, because of the fact is they are only an abortion center. They don't give referrals for adoption or any of these other things, because that's against their actual motto for what they want for making money. When it comes to actually the opposite end, we'll look at the opposite end, which is from the pro-life perspective as an individualist. If we look at that, we have to actually go back to the founding documents. One of the founding documents is the Declaration of Independence, which guarantees the right to life. Now, if we're going to look at the right to life as an actual fully pro-life thing, you must be against the death penalty, you must be against war, and you must be against abortion. This is because the fact is everybody should have an actual right to live out their life, no matter if they've committed a crime or not. Because the fact is you have to view life as actually having meaning, and that you as an actual human do not have the right to strike down life. Only a superior being does, as you don't possess that right to declare who is good and who is not. And this is the whole point, as opposed to who does and who doesn't have this right. Now, when it comes down to why we do this, it's one of the founding documents, and it's really should be considered a core to the actual belief system of the nation. And when we denounce this, we're kind of essentially denouncing what is actually a core to the nation, and we really shouldn't be doing this. Now we can look at what this would actually mean. This is essentially going to impact the way we handle foreign entanglements. It also impacts the way we handle alliances, and it also impacts what we do domestically. It would essentially overturn Roe v. Wade to basically meaning we only can do abortions for the life of for being risk of the life of the mother, because it would be essentially saving the older life to essentially protect, like as in the case of if she has other kids to take care of, to essentially make sure the caretaker lives. And this would be the case. This would be the whole reason of the abortion itself. Now, in the case of this, we would view it basically is to protect life at all costs, and it would basically be to protect it, to ensure that basically no one dies, and to basically stay up to these medical oaths that you're basically supposed to be helping helping life and aiding life, not trying to kill it. And essentially, as a medical professional, that should be your goal, not trying to eradicate life, which is essentially why some of these doctors that go into these abortion clinics are essentially violating the Hippocratic Oath by doing so. When you go into that, you're essentially just turning your whole back. You can't just say, "Oh, this is a ball of cells," because in many cases they've gone to some of these places and they're doing these late-term abortions even in the third trimester, and these are completely viable babies. I mean, we've even had children that can even be born quite early and still become viable living adults without many problems. And yet we're talking that they would essentially abort these babies well past that point. And it's kind of a sick fact that that we're getting people that are proclaiming themselves as doctors and that are actually engaging in homicide. And this is where it essentially engages. This is essentially what it is. This from this aspect, it essentially is nothing but homicide. And if you really and if you're going with your Hippocratic Oath, you should essentially be declaring yourself you're not a doctor anymore. You should basically hand your license right back, because if you're engaging in homicide now, you're essentially nothing more than the serial killer down the street, because you're doing nothing more than that. And you're basically saying, I want this for money. Now, basically, all this is this is the exact copy of what people like H.H. Holmes did. Now, technically, H.H. Holmes was a doctor as well, but he was really only known as being a serial killer and scam artist. And that's really all what these abortionists are. They're serial killers and they're scam artists. Nothing more. They're scamming women out of money and obviously the government and the taxpayer, and they're essentially killing people by essentially the hundreds and thousands. And when it comes down to that, is really, that's from the pro-life perspective, that's really what you should really view them as, because essentially if we need to have one view of what doctors are, and they're meant to preserve life. And if they can't keep an oath to do that, they aren't doctors. They're essentially murderers if they're going to basically sit around and say, "Oops, I'm just going to let this person die." And they're doing the same thing to the women that are actually laying up there, because they're not even viewing them as an actual patient. They're just viewing them as a source of income. And this is where things are getting very, very disturbing. And this is where we need to actually view it as an actual serious crime, because they're saying we don't want to actually upgrade our facilities because it might actually cost a little bit more money, even though it might actually save some lives. And this is a serious issue that we need to be looking at. And if there's someone out there that's willing to say that, they seriously need to be going to jail if they're even going to be stating such a thing, because that is just a horribly wrong thing to state. If you're willing to basically save a few bucks just because you don't want to essentially upgrade your facility. Now, this is even just even from a basic pro-choice thing. Anybody pro-choice to be saying, I want these things to at least be up to a decent level that we can get gurneys back and forth through to ensure that these women are basically 100% safe. Now, if you're for women's health, the women should be 100% safe. And this means if the abortion is being performed, it better be performed by a doctor, not some medical professional, not some freaking receptionist. And you better believe that with these new laws passed, they're going to stretch it to say, hey, I just had the receptionist that was here 2 days ago perform an abortion because I just told them how to do it. Because when you start stretching it out to say, hey, it could be any medical professional. They're going to basically stretch. There's going to be places that are going to stretch it away a lot farther than that. And when it comes to these major cities, there's going to be inspectors going to be looking the other way when it comes to protecting people. We know exactly what happened with the Kermit Gosnell case, and that was because they knew it was politically negative if they would have actually exposed that. They would have actually caused some serious damage to the Democratic Party if they would have done that. Even early points with it, people knew that if Kermit Gosnell would have actually been essentially arrested at the start of all of this, that basically Roe v. Wade would have never passed. Roe v. Wade was essentially passed because of support of Gosnell out in Philadelphia. It was because of his action where he was saying, don't worry about a couple of these women getting getting severely damaged because of these pro bono abortions. They needed them and they begged for them, and this was basically the case that happened with him. So based on that, is he pretty much, he was scolded for this, he still escaped through, and they were still using this as a basis of passing through Roe v. Wade. Now, if he would essentially went to jail right then and there for actions like that and been stripped of everything and lost everything with his practice and was never allowed to even enter into anything close to that, we would have seen that the Roe v. Wade would have never passed to begin with, because he was such a crucial figure in this. Where a lot of people don't realize is people would have said, it doesn't matter if people are trying this stuff illegally. This is something we're dealing with homicide here, and even in these situations, we can't allow women to basically be put into these situations where they could seriously die, because there were cases where women that he gave these pro bono abortions almost died because of what he did. And this is and what happened later was women did die under his care because of what he did. And we know that this happens regularly because of these horrible, horrible cases of abortion clinics, and even under major ones such as Planned Parenthood, women die because they're unwilling to have clean facilities. They're unwilling to have facilities in which gurneys can go through the hallways because they say it'll cost them too much. Basically what that means, they don't want to relocate because the demographics are different. It's all about demographics. And as Kermit Gosnell stated, nobody wants to adopt a black baby according to him. This is all about basically hatred of certain races, and they want to eliminate them. It has nothing to do with actual women's health. It has to do with fulfilling the actual original ideas of Margaret Sanger. And it doesn't matter which race you are with it, you're still going to try to fulfill the obligation of her and other eugenicists. And I know this is going to sound extreme, and it's going to sound a little bit harsh, but this is really the case. And it's really about pretty much eugenicists versus basic people who want to actually protect life. And even if you are somewhat in the middle with like a pro-choice, you should at least stand by for some basic standards for these places, and at least stand by for the idea that they should at least be able to have some money from these procedures if they're going to sell these body parts. Because when they're selling these body parts and they're getting thousands upon thousands of dollars for them for each one, you have to understand that they should have an itemized list of what they're making, and they should be able to essentially earn the majority of that money for themselves. Not be basically told, oh, we're doing this as a favor for you, and this is basically going to help you out, and see how this is helping out the community. and you're able to live as a free woman and do what you want and all this other garbage. Meanwhile, basically, they're getting tax subsidies. They're making a lot of money off these sales of fetal tissue, which is illegal technically. And on top of that is they're stealing from the taxpayer. They're stealing from the women. They're committing atrocities. Basically, they don't care about the life of the woman. They don't care about the life of. They obviously don't care about the life of the baby because they're just killing it, no matter what stage it is. Essentially, they want certain stages so they can essentially supply it to the specific buyer, and then when it comes down to it, they really don't care about this idea of diversity that they try to proclaim in their videos, because the fact is they keep up the legacy of Margaret Sanger by putting the actual places in specific locations, and when they're asked to upgrade or move to basically get to better facilities, they're saying that they can't because it'll be too costly for their business, which is an actual lie, because they know in their cases that they'd have to relocate, which means the demographics are going to be completely different, which means that actually race is actually a factor in their business choice. This is actually a sole decision on what they're making their business choices on. You never find any of these abortion clinics in middle class or upper class areas. You always find them in these poor areas, and it's actually aimed at these minorities specifically, and it's meant to essentially eradicate them. And that's the whole point, which means they've never changed since their foundation as the Birth Control League. The Birth Control League is no different than Planned Parenthood now, and the other different abortion groups are no different that have actually popped up since Roe v. Wade as well. They're doing the same thing. And they're going to make the excuse that don't go with the pro-life groups that want to set you up to adopt out. The reason why is because they're losing money. They don't want you to do that with it. Meanwhile, the fact is this is essentially going to be the more humane option. And this is where I would sit at and saying, well, if they're going to adopt out and it's a better solution for them, why is it a problem? It should be viewed as an actual problem when it comes to abortion. If they're getting a solution that fits for them, and you're supposed to be helping them get their best solution, and essentially you're actually supposed to be providing them with an actual list of options, then why are you so angry when these trucks come by offering free ultrasounds, and at which you guys actually charge for, and they actually come by and give these free ultrasounds, and they actually offer them options for the for different pro-life solutions, such as adoption, or actually when they see the child, keeping the child itself. The reason why is because there's an actual financial incentive to actually abort, and that this is why and there's been people who left Planned Parenthood who actually verify this whole thing. They're looking actually at a business model of abortion, and it's not an actual private group it's private charity that's actually doing this as an actual charity that wouldn't care about the outcome. They're actually caring about the outcome of the actual whole thing itself. Now, I hope you like this controversial thing. I'll give you one more later today on immigration. That'll probably touch into a few things, probably anger a few more people as well, as I hope to get a few more viewers from that. And I'll see you guys later tonight. Bye.